But the noise of those years, the gunfire, the marching, the screaming, still echoes in my mind.
Welcome back to Eventalis, where we uncover the untold stories of history through the eyes of those who lived it. Today, we step into the shoes of a journalist navigating the aftermath of World War I, a world torn apart, yet slowly piecing itself back together. If you enjoy content like this, please hit subscribe and tap the bell. For me, it's your way of supporting the channel, helping us bring more incredible stories to life and ensuring you never miss an episode that dives deep into the moments that shaped our world.
It's been over 50 years since the war ended, but some things, they don't fade away. I'm writing this now in the quiet of my office, but the noise of those years, the gunfire, the marching, the screaming, still echoes in my mind. And I'm asking myself, how do you tell the story of what came after? Not just the battles fought, but the battles that went on long after the guns fell silent. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand how a world can heal when its very foundation is torn apart. Maybe this is the answer, or maybe it's just a question I'll never stop asking. I've been a journalist for more than half my life, and yet this story, this one story, feels too big to write. But someone has to tell it. The world thought the end of the war meant peace, but peace was never what we found. So here I am, trying to make sense of a world broken by war and what came after. A world I lived through, a world I had to learn how to survive. When the guns finally stopped in 1918, the world exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The war to end all wars was over, and yet. The aftermath was nothing like the peace we had dreamed of. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to restore order, but instead, it sowed the seeds of a new kind of instability. Germany was forced to take full responsibility for the war, paying reparations that crippled its economy. The country's national debt skyrocketed, and inflation ran rampant. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1914 reached 200 billion marks by 1923. It was a tragedy, but also a clear symbol of the chaos that gripped Europe. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed into several smaller states, and the Ottoman Empire, which had once stretched across much of the Middle East, faded into history. The maps were redrawn. New borders were drawn, creating new nations, but also new tensions. Nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born, but they were fractured, ethnic tensions simmering beneath the surface. Empires fell, new powers rose. The world that emerged from the ashes of the war was anything but stable. But if the political structures were in shambles, the economy was no better. European economies were shattered by the war. Entire industries, once booming, were now devastated. The war had consumed vast amounts of resources, fuel, food, manpower, resources that could have gone toward rebuilding but were instead spent in the flames of destruction. Germany, in particular, was suffering under the crushing weight of reparations. The nation was so deep in debt that the only way to pay its dues was to print more money. This led to one of the most extreme cases of hyperinflation in history. In 1923, the value of the German mark collapsed entirely. I remember writing about people burning banknotes to keep warm. A wheelbarrow full of marks was worth less than a loaf of bread. In the United States, the economy had prospered during the war, but by the early 1920s, the stock market was teetering. Europe's economic weakness had a ripple effect on the global market. The United States was beginning to see the cracks in the system as well, though it wasn't until the Great Depression in 1929 that the full scale of economic catastrophe would become clear. The post-war economy was built on quicksand. Governments borrowed heavily to rebuild, but the global economic system was fragile. Despite the efforts of governments and the dawning of new policies, recovery was slow and painful. Some nations never fully recovered. And so, I began to wonder, How could you rebuild a world when the very foundations had been so thoroughly destroyed?
It wasn't just the economy that had been shaken, it was society itself. I could see it all around me. Women, for the first time, had taken on roles that had once been exclusively male. During the war, they worked in factories, on farms, and in the fields. They served as nurses on the front lines, and when the war ended, many of them weren't ready to go back to their kitchens. In Britain, the suffrage movement had gained ground, and women were granted the right to vote. In the United States, women's participation in the workforce led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting them the right to vote as well. But this new world was not universally welcomed. I saw how men, returning from the front lines, struggled to adapt to the changing roles of women in society. The old gender norms were being upended, and not everyone was comfortable with that. The pushback was fierce, but it was also inevitable. Women had tasted freedom during the war, and they weren't ready to let go of it. On the streets, I saw the young men returning from the battlefield, wounded physically, emotionally scarred, and forever changed by their experiences. Their lives had been torn apart, and yet society demanded they return to normalcy. But how could they? How could any of us? The world had barely begun to recover from the Great War when a new terror emerged, silent, invisible, and merciless. The Spanish flu of 1918 spread with a speed and ferocity that stunned a population already battered by years of bloodshed. It was a pandemic unlike any the modern world had seen, infecting nearly 1/3 of humanity and claiming an estimated 50 million lives, far surpassing the death toll of the war itself. Peace had barely been declared when the specter of death returned, this time without the sound of gunfire or the flash of artillery. Entire towns became unrecognizable as quarantine measures locked down communities. The bustling streets of cities grew eerily quiet, save for the mournful tolling of funeral bells. Hospitals were overwhelmed beyond capacity, their wards overflowing with the sick and dying. Medical staff, already drained from the war, faced an enemy they didn't understand and couldn't cure. The science of viruses had not yet been discovered, and doctors had no knowledge of how to combat the H1N1 influenza strain that was sweeping the globe. Remedies were primitive, often focused on symptom relief rather than treatment, and public health measures, though well-intentioned, were frequently contradictory. Face masks were recommended in some places, but not universally enforced. Some believed fresh air could cure the flu, while others turned to ineffective potions and tonics. The flu struck indiscriminately, rich and poor, young and old, war survivors and civilians alike. Its grip was swift and unrelenting. Many died within days of their first symptoms, leaving families shattered and societies teetering on the edge of collapse. Secondary infections, like pneumonia, often proved fatal due to overcrowded and unsanitary hospital conditions. Without the advanced tools of modern medicine, such as ventilators or antiviral drugs, the flu claimed millions in a way that felt beyond the realm of human control. It was a disease that showed no mercy, and no one was spared. The pandemic mirrored the war in its cruelty, sparing no one and offering no reprieve. For many, it felt as though the world itself was unwilling to grant peace. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, the resilience of the human spirit persisted. Life, though forever altered, carried on. As the flu finally receded, it left behind not just scars, but also a somber understanding of humanity's fragility and its ability to endure. The numbers never told the full story. The millions of dead, the soldiers lost in battle, the civilians caught in a war they never chose. On paper, it was all just statistics. But the moment I saw the faces, those numbers became real. The widows whose eyes held an unspoken sorrow, the children who would never know their fathers, the families torn apart by the violence and its lingering aftermath. The war may have claimed millions, but its true cost stretched far beyond the battlefield. The flu, poverty, and emotional scars added layers of suffering that couldn't be measured. The true toll wasn't only in the lives lost, but in the lasting scars carried by those left behind. One could see families trying to pick up the pieces, but grief was a weight they could never shake, the loss and ache that never faded, and yet life had to go on. There was no other choice. The world had to rebuild, but the wounds would never fully heal. I could write about the numbers, the tragedies, but no statistic could ever capture the depth of that sorrow, the sense of living in the aftermath where the war's shadow would never truly fade. Here we are, decades later, and the world somehow endures. The cities have risen again, though they'll never fully be what they once were. The roads have been paved, the buildings reconstructed, but the echoes of the past still linger. People have moved forward, each in their own way, carrying with them the weight of what was lost. I've spent my life writing about it all, the wars, the struggles, the rebuilding. And in every story, I've seen nations push forward, piece by piece. I've written about their triumphs, their failures, the scars they carry. But one thing is certain, the echoes of the past still resonate in everything we do, shaping the world in ways we may never fully understand. I've shared with you what I've seen, but this is just the beginning. The story of the aftermath is as complex as the war itself. We haven't even begun to fully understand the long-term effects of the Spanish flu, or how the global economy was altered by the war. In the coming episodes, I'll dive deeper into the specific aspects of this world we built from the ruins. We'll explore how the economy was reshaped by the Great Depression and how the world struggled to recover. I'll take you into the lives of those who lived through the social changes and how the political landscape shifted in ways we could never have anticipated. This story is far from over. It's a story of loss, of survival, and of hope. And it's a story we still live with today. So stay with me as we go deeper into the aftermath of World War I.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through Evantalis, where we explore history's hidden tales through the perspectives of those who experienced it. Today, we've walked alongside a writer chronicling the turmoil of post-World War I, a time of rebuilding amidst the wreckage. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon. By doing so, you're helping us share even more incredible stories and ensuring you're always in the loop for every new episode that takes you deeper into the events that changed the course of history.